Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today is a very special video, so I brought along a special guest, Batvel. You wanna introduce yourself, Batvel?
Hey everybody, long-time listener, member of the fandom and these types of reviews and videos and discussions on films.
Yeah, so essentially we're gonna talk about one of the most pivotal and important sci-fi films of all time, the original Blade Runner. And I kind of want to start this off by going through what was your first experience seeing Blade Runner, and how did you come across it?
Oh wow. I think it was in college. I hadn't seen, this was I saw Blade Runner after it came out in theaters, way after, like years after. So it must have been, I don't know, before 2011. And at that point, I had heard that there was multiple cuts of the movie. Like, I think at that point there was like 3 or 4 cuts of the movie already. I had heard the best one was the director's cut, so that's the one that I saw. And then to this day, the only version of Blade Runner that I've actually seen is the director's cut. I haven't seen any of the other versions.
Interesting. So, like you said, there's many different versions of this movie, but I started off watching the original, and it was kind of crazy how I watched this movie because I had heard about Blade Runner, and I never actually seen the film, but I remember the conditions to which I saw this movie, I think affected a lot of how I have an opinion of it. Because I remember watching this movie when I was very sick. I was bedridden sick. So I literally couldn't move. I was laying in bed switching through the channels, watching TV. And I think I saw a commercial on the Sci-Fi channel, and the announcer was like, the most compelling vision of the future ever created. I was like, oh, this sounds good. I mean, I can't really go anywhere, so I'll just watch this. So I remember watching it, and it was an overwhelming experience for me because I was already sick. So seeing all the lighting and all the crazy visuals, and I was kind of half delirious, and the fact that I couldn't go anywhere, so I was kind of absorbed in this whole world, and it kind of had a very profound impact on me. So I don't know if it affected you in the same way, but because I know you came in a little bit later in the game. I kind of came in late to the game too. I wasn't a fan of this movie until I saw it. I was probably I don't know, maybe 15, 16 years old when I first saw it.
So yeah, so I was much later. I must have been like 3rd or 4th year of college, maybe 2nd year of college. So, one of the things that you mentioned right away is the visuals of the film, right? And I think that's probably the strongest element of the film is the visuals. Up until that point, that genre of films, I think the movie's based off a short science fiction story called I Dream of Electric Sheep or something like that. I never read it, but it's the genre, of Blade Runner-esque films, in literature, had existed before. But when you think about films from that visual element of those types of stories, that was probably one of the first ones, because I know after after Blade Runner, the original one came out. What's his name said that he was directly influenced by the guy who did RoboCop. He said that he was watching Blade Runner in the theaters, and he saw that the police car that they have in Blade Runner, like that hovering police car.
Oh, the spinner, yeah.
Yeah, and he got the idea. He was like, wow, what if in this world there was a cop driving that police car? What would he look like? And then he came up with the script for Blade Runner. Or the idea for, sorry, not Blade Runner, RoboCop.
Interesting. I had no idea.
So RoboCop was directly influenced from Blade Runner because the guy saw the police car, and he was thinking, what kind of cop in this type of futuristic world driving that police car? Came up with the idea of RoboCop. If you watch Fifth Element, they have a similar type of hovering police cars and hovering taxis, and the same type of kind of skyscraper-ish futuristic world, like advertisements on buildings and things like that. So, and I don't remember when Fifth Element came out, but I think it was the late 80s, and I think Blade Runner was 82, 83, something like that, early 80s.
I think Fifth Element was like late 90s.
Yeah, but it was definitely after Blade.
Oh yeah, way after.
Yeah, so a lot of films I feel like a lot of films were influenced by Blade Runner visually. I still think, like, the new version of Blade Runner, the 2049, I'm more of a fan of the new version than a fan of the original version, because there's so many things of the original that, like, I would just take it in a whole different direction, because Ridley Scott's always been strong with visuals, right? Alien, Blade Runner, Gladiator had good visuals. Like, his films always have good visuals. But I'm not a fan of Harrison Ford, and I don't think Ridley Scott is the most subtle filmmaker. I think sometimes in his plot, in his narratives, he can be a little bit heavy-handed. And, like, for example, there's a scene in Blade Runner where Rachel, the replicant, where the Tyrell Corporation, they create Rachel, but she's a little bit unique because she has memories, and she's kind of like a special model. She's in the apartment with Harrison Ford's character. After she saved him, she ends up shooting the other replicant. I forget what his name is, Leo, maybe. The scene where the guy says, where he's beating him up, he says, "Wake up, time to die."
Oh yeah, I think his name was Leon.
Yeah, Leon. And so they're in his apartment after that scene, and he's kind of like, I think he's like patching himself up. He's over the sink, like bleeding and everything, and he's patching himself up. And she says something like, "If I was to go north, would you follow me or would you hunt me down?" And he says that he wouldn't, because he owes her one, but somebody would. And it immediately goes into like a montage type of sequence where he's kind of falls asleep, and she ends up changing her hair, and then she ends up playing the piano, and there's like this jazz music playing, this like kind of like if you watch like those cliched like crime thriller movies where that jazz score comes up usually, and I think they end up making love or hooking up or something. And I remember thinking when I saw that, because I saw that scene today, I remember thinking, like, the way that Ridley Scott directs it is very heavy-handed. Like, he very, very, like, it's very on the nose. The music is a little too much. Like, and I think he does that throughout Blade Runner. Like, I like the score overall, but do you feel like there's certain scenes where you're watching in Blade Runner and you're watching the scene and then the score comes in, or a jazz type of music comes in, or something like that, like musically, right? And I don't know, I had myself watching it and thinking, like, well, the visuals are very strong. The interactions are kind of like subtle. So I feel like because of his strong visuals and because the interactions are subtle, and he pumps up the music and he really intercuts the visuals with the music, it's too much at the same time, and you lose a little bit of the character work, and you lose a little bit of the nuance, because I also think Harrison Ford is against type in this movie. Like, when I think Harrison Ford, I think he, as an actor, he's at his strongest when he's doing films where he's got like a character with a mouth on him, right? Like Indiana Jones.
No, I agree completely. I honestly, like, I really don't even, I've never been a fan of Harrison Ford, but I think for this particular movie, like, the sort of like dryness of his acting, it actually does work.
Yeah,
because
it's very dry, very boring, right?
Yeah, but the thing is, like, it works because he's a very retired cop, and he does not want to deal with this shit anymore. And I think because of the way Harrison Ford is as an actor, it's very believable, because, like, even in the first scene when they're approaching him at the noodle bar, and he's like, "You got the wrong guy, pal. I'm not interested in any work right now. Just leave me alone. Let me eat my noodles." So I think it actually works in this movie. But yeah, man, I mean, I think, this is why, like, talk bad guys are the best guys, because you brought up a very, very good point at the beginning. This is the first movie that has ever been made that has taken the cyberpunk genre from like books and comics for film. And I think Riley Scott is like the perfect guy for this because like he is very much a visual storyteller. Like you were saying, I mean, the thing is like he loves to do world building based on his visuals, and I think this movie is like 85-95% just world building based on the visuals. There's not even that much like the only time you get any kind of real explicit like explanation of what's happening in the world is at the beginning with that white text. They tell you everything you need to know in that white text. You know who Blade Runners are, what they do, Parallel Corporation, what they do, and they throw you into the world. And I think the best movies, to me, kind of just throw you in. And I think another movie that does this is Ghost in the Shell, because it's a great way for the audience to sort of like, okay.
Ghost in the Shell, the animated movie, or the one with Johansson, Scarlett Johansson?
No, the anime, because if you're not paying attention in Ghost in the Shell, you will not know what's going on. Everything is kind of just thrown in sort of haphazardly, and like they'll throw a line in here or there, and you're like, okay, I caught this, I caught that, and you kind of you build the world based on what people are saying, and I think this movie does that really well. Just the way that like, I mean, we're gonna go into it, but there's long monologues in this movie that produce some of the craziest visuals, like without even showing anything. I mean, for God's sakes, like the last speech that Rutger Hauer gives is like one of the most craziest speeches I think I've ever heard in cinema.
That's the one with teardrops in the rain, something like that.
God, man, and the guy apparently the guy just kind of just made that up as, you know, improv as he was going. But anyway, I think like the impact of this movie goes beyond like, because to me this is cyberpunk. Like a lot of people like, you know, they'll talk about like different media and stuff like that, but like, has there ever been a movie that has like come out since this that has had the same kind of like impact aesthetically as this? Because I don't think there's anything. Yeah, go ahead.
You can count them in probably one or two hands, right? So you've got Blade Runner. Blade Runner 2049, I guess, would be a variation of it. You got Terminator 2, which is definitely cyberpunk influenced, right? You've got Fifth Element, which is another one. RoboCop, which I guess that's the most grounded version of, because cyberpunk, the whole like the first like, God, I forget what some of those novels were, but
well, you had like stuff like stuff like Neuromancer and like all these different stuff.
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. So like cyberpunk, it deals with themes of like people have like artificial limbs and different things like that, right? So you could see the connection between Blade Runner and Terminator, because the replicants, this biotechnological human being, is kind of similar to like T-1000 is like a machine, but like bio skin on the outside.
Bad value there.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I lost you for a second there. So can you repeat what you said?
Yeah. So I was saying that Blade Runner and Terminator, they're very similar when you talk about like the replicants and the T-1000, because it's like this fusion of like technology and robotics with, you know, like the T-1000 is like machine underneath, you know, bio skin on the outside, and the replicants are like a fusion of bio tissue and like technology, right? So it's similar. But it's interesting because like it's almost like, you know, how have you ever heard anybody say, you know, you give like 2 or 3 filmmakers the same script and the same story and see how they do it differently, right? Like I think you see this between Blade Runner 2049 and the original Blade Runner, because it's all about what you thematically focus in on, right? Like in Blade Runner, in the original Blade Runner, I think it's the replicant Rachel. She asks him a question, right? And she goes, have you ever killed a human being, right, by accident, right? And I think he says no, and, you know, that he's never killed a human being by accident, thinking it was a replicant. So to me, that's the thematic juice of like Blade Runner, because I kind of look at it like a combination of cyberpunk with film noir. In film noir from the 50s and 40s, like you look at Deckard like a detective or a headhunter, right? Like film noir has a lot to do with paranoia, like and this whole theme of like, can you tell a replicant from a human being? Can you tell a human being from a replicant? This is already in the story. It's already in the narrative. So for me, like it makes sense. You approach a Blade Runner story from a paranoia, like from the aspect of, you know, when like a cop in a lot of like cop stories and crime thrillers accidentally kills somebody and then they have that guilt with them, or they have to deal with like even if you've seen like a James Bond film where he's dealing with like psychological issues from like field work, right? And then they have to be cleared to be ready for the field, right? It's already in Blade Runner, right? Like they have those tests that they give the replicants, they have the tests that they give the agent. You know, you see it in Blade Runner 2049, you see it with Deckard to make sure like they're psychologically ready to go back on the field, right? To do what they do. So to me, the theme, if you focused in on it, of not only like the question of, you know, here you are a detective or a cop, you know, and you killed the wrong person, or did you kill a human being instead of a replicant? I think it would be interesting if you never even find out, right? Like you kill someone and you don't know if it was right or wrong. You don't know if they were framed or not. You don't know if they were human or replicant. Like to me, you combine that with like the paranoia of film noir and like the cynicism of like a film noir world, and that's interesting. But Ridley Scott, what he chooses to focus on is he kind of chooses to focus in on the replicant's perspective, right? Like if you had to ask me like, what's the character that Ridley Scott probably identifies with the most in his movie, and it's the guy with the white hair, the antagonist that you mentioned, right? That's probably the most interesting character, but it's also the character that I feel that Ridley Scott identifies with the most. When you look at Blade Runner 2049, it's a different perspective because it focuses more on Kay, Ryan Gosling's character, right? So it's almost like it depends where you put your sensibility as a filmmaker. Like for example, I mentioned that Ridley Scott's very heavy-handed, that he's like very strong visually, but he's very heavy-handed combining his music with his visuals in moments where a different director would focus in on that moment differently. So there's a scene in the original Blade Runner where Deckard he encounters that girl replicant, the first one that he kills, and there's a scene where she's running away from him and he's chasing after her before Leon gets a hold of him, and he shoots her, right? And when he shoots her in the back as she's running away, and then she crashes through, like she runs through this like glass like pane or whatever it is, right? So in that scene where he shoots her as she's running away from him and she goes through the glass, and then all the cops come and they kind of block off the crime scene, and he says he's a detective. That scene plays very strong visually. It's like a slow motion scene, but it's also like intercut with this music that comes in that's very loud, right? It's like this very loud soundtrack. So Ridley Scott plays that moment with this kind of music and this slow motion like sequence where he's trying to get you to feel empathy for the replicant, right? Like here's a replicant that didn't want to be killed, that wanted to have a life, an individual life, and he's trying to get you to feel empathetic for the replicant character. And Deckard's kind of looking at her as she's dead, as the cops are coming around the scene. But if you compare that scene to a scene in Blade Runner 2049, right? Blade Runner 2049 tries to do the same thing but does it more effectively. And it's the scene at the very beginning of the movie where Kay is, the new model, the NEX-9 or whatever it is, and he's talking with Dave Bautista's NEX-6, the older model.
Oh man, that scene was so good. That scene was money.
That was an amazing scene. It's probably one of my favorite things that I've seen Bautista in. Right,
Dave
Bautista.
You know that scene was supposed to be the beginning, I think, of Blade Runner, the original.
Yeah, but what is he? He's like a farmer of like insects or something. Like he's on some planet and he's like farming, right?
Yeah.
It's like
Because I believe they don't have food anymore, so they have to use insects in the future. I believe something along those lines. But they set up this whole backstory in a YouTube video. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's like a mini movie that they put out before the movie came out.
But that scene, right? Like, and Dave Bautista's not the best actor in the world, right? But that scene, the way that Villeneuve approaches it versus Ridley Scott is it's less heavy-handed. And I'm not saying Villeneuve is like the best director when it comes to drama either, because he's a very visual director as well. But in that scene, it's easier to feel empathetic for Dave Bautista as a replicant versus, the girl replicant in Ridley Scott's original version, because Ridley Scott shot it almost like a ballet, slow motion action, music blasting, no dialogue. He had Harrison Ford look at her with a look. So it was very much a visual sequence, right? Whereas with Ryan Gosling and Dave Bautista, it's a dialogue sequence. I don't even think there's any music at all. In fact, they go through the whole dialogue scene and then they start having the altercation where they're fighting. And even while they're fighting, there's no dialogue at all. There's no music at all, right? So you hear like the fighting, you hear like, obviously Dave Bautista's an older model, but he's bigger. And Ryan Gosling's a newer model, but he's smaller. So there's like that contrast of the newer model can probably take more punishment and can probably fight better. But the older model, Dave Bautista, is just a bigger model of an older version.
You know what's
right?
crazy?
Almost like the TV Terminator and the original.
Exactly.
And the new Terminator, right?
Man, this is why I always say, like, dude, like, see, I bring on the guests that pull out the golden nuggets, man. And you just said it. I was thinking that before you even said it. Everything ties back into these 80s films, man. The psychology of the T1000 and the bigger, older model versus the sleeker, newer model. That thing has been around for ages. And I didn't even notice that until you brought it up. Anyway,
and what's great is that's probably one of the best handled scenes that I've seen from Villeneuve in any of his films. Because...
Oh yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, I still prefer the original, but there are scenes in Blade Runner 2049 that literally knocked my socks off when I was watching it in the theater. So he didn't, I think overall, he made a good film, he just didn't make the film that I wanted. But that's a personal problem.
That's interesting.
We can go into that a bit more later, but...
Well, he went with the... And it's great because I think it's a good scene because it hits on a lot of thematic notes, right? So it's like you've got the new model who takes physical damage, but he fights better. And you see this, when he fights with Bautista, he has better fighting movement, right? So even though he has better fighting movement, the Bautista version has more strength, right? So he can take a little bit of a beating, even though he's not great. It's similar to the T1000 in that it's not graceful, it's not good fighting movement, it's not fluid as the new version, it's not sleek, but it could take some punishment in an old school kind of way, right? Almost like if you're looking at like a Porsche in a 90s muscle car, right? It's just a different machine. So it's funny because then they have the exchange, and he says what's one of the differences is, we don't run, you run, right? Whereas the older model is like not looking at it as running away, it's looking at it as like having your own life, right? Like running towards your own life to be left alone, right? So it plays on that, it plays on the new version of the machine. But then it's also like, thematically speaking, like in Villeneuve's version, he focuses in on the question of he's trying to figure out, because he's got these memories, right? So he's trying to figure out if he's real or not, or if he's a replicant or not, or who was this daughter of the Rachel of Rachel and Deckard, who were these twins? Was one a boy and one was a girl, and they're both real kids, and maybe he's one of those kids, or later on he comes to find out that it wasn't him, that it was a girl, because the woman says that she witnessed it was a girl. So that's an interesting question. But I think Villeneuve, that's one of his problems when he did Blade Runner, is that that complicates the plot a lot because you have to think back to the original Blade Runner between Rachel and Deckard, and then you kind of have to grapple with the idea of, well, how does a replicant really work, right? Like a replicant's supposed to be human and machine, but then you're saying a replicant can have a kid. Well, then if a replicant has a kid, then that kid, is it a normal human being? I mean, because you're not gonna genetically pass on technology, right? So it brings up like a very interesting question, which I don't think you want the audience to have. I don't think you want the audience to have that question.
It's always
better.
It's always the thing with sci-fi. Like any good sci-fi makes you question, and ask questions. So I think like the fact that they made it like yeah, go ahead.
I think he made it more challenging for himself because that's a tough question to handle as a filmmaker. Like your plot could easily be disproved.
It's very heavy-handed stuff, and like I mean, I think ultimately that's one of the most like interesting themes in like the Blade Runner films is like because I don't remember like a movie having a villain before that. By the end of the movie, I'm like, damn, I feel bad for this guy. He was actually just trying to live. So I think like having that idea of like a machine sort of bioengineered to be a person but not born. Because do you remember that scene when Hayes in the office talking to that woman and then she's like, you're doing pretty good without one. And he's like, without what? A soul. He just has this like depressed look in his face as he leaves. I'm like, Jesus. So it's a crazy idea. I mean, the amount of like creativity that was put into that, and it's intentionally like ambiguous because like they never really go into like the nitty-gritty technical aspects of what makes, you know, replicant work. But I think that's part of the genius of it because it's like at the end of the day, these machines are just like anyone else, really. I mean, like how do you define human? You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's. I feel like there's two thematic levels like you can approach it. There's the surface level themes, which is you've got a detective and a hunter of replicants, and then you have replicants that, you know, in the same way Terminator, they look like human beings. So in a city full of people, how do you know who's a replicant and who's not, right? So that's like the surface level plot mechanics that are very effective, right? Because that could be a really interesting like espionage, cyberpunk, sci-fi thriller type of film. It's like even The Matrix, like who's an agent and who's not, right? Like an agent can take over the body of somebody in the Matrix in a moment's notice, right? So there's almost like this, I don't want to say claustrophobic theme to it, but there is this theme that if you're in a city full of people and a replicant can be anybody, an agent can take over anybody, a T-1000 can be anybody or look like anybody, they're all dealing with that same surface level theme of a singular detective in a city full of people that could be a threat, right? It could be a replicant, but it doesn't look like a threat. It could be an agent, but a moment ago it was just some random computer program, right? So they all have that same exact thematic surface level theme, but then the question is like the deeper themes as a filmmaker, what do you focus on? So Ridley Scott, he focused on the antagonist. He focused on the replicants. Like, you know, replicants are these like slaves of this futuristic society, and they just want to have an individual life, and they're trying to, you know, live and escape death, which is something all human beings try to do or have a probably desire for. So you can relate to it, and he kind of makes that his most poetic character, right? He makes his detective with Harrison Ford a little bit dry, but he makes his antagonist kind of a lot more interesting, right? So you relate to him better. And I think that actor does a much better acting job than Harrison Ford, to be honest, right?
Oh my god.
Then,
have you have you seen any of the other cuts?
No, just that one. I'm sure he has so many outtakes though. I'm sure he has so many variations to his scenes that all of them work.
Listen, man, like there's a cut of the film when this guy is literally narrating himself and what he's thinking at the end of the movie. And from what I understood, like, he kind of phoned in his performance because he didn't want them. He intentionally, like, did a horrible job because he wanted them not to put that in the movie.
Well,
So
that's one way to approach it, right? That's effective.
it's actually like quite funny. Like, I think you could look it up on YouTube, but it's really really bad. And I'm like, damn. But
Compared to the other stuff he was doing, right?
yeah, he's just sort of. It sounds exactly like he's just reading off a page in a sound booth. Like he's literally not putting any effort whatsoever. But yeah, I think we should probably talk about the visuals in this because I remember like I actually put like the introduction of Blade Runner as like probably like one of the craziest things I've ever seen like in my life. Like the way that movie opens and the way that they introduce the world. Like I watch that thing every now and then on YouTube, man, just to kind of like get absorbed. Like the way the music plays, the things you see.
The cityscape, the landscape with the fire and the skyscrapers and the
Oh
buildings
my
and everything.
God, man! Like, and that was all done in practical effects, and it looks incredible.
Yes, let's talk about that. Practical effects. So, that's a good point. Like when I was watching Fifth Element yesterday, right? And all these films, right? So the original Blade Runner, Fifth Element, Batman Returns, probably most films from that time period. But I mentioned those three films because those three films had a very strong visual setting, right? Like very strong atmospheric films. All those three films, Fifth Element, Batman Returns, and the original Blade Runner, they all had real effects. They all had miniatures. They were using miniatures, or they built sets of like the whole city, right? And then when you look at the behind the scenes, you notice like the miniatures for like, you know, the vehicles, and then you look at the sets where they have these like gigantic sets, and you have like, you know, cameramen and crew walking through like a set where the building is as big as like a human being.
Listen,
right?
man, that was incredible.
And they just shot with smaller, like they just shot it as if it was like, I guess they got it in perspective, so it doesn't look like a miniature. But yeah, like that technique really works, and we could probably say that if they were to do real effects like that today, they could probably build better sets, right? Like they could probably do it even better. So there's such a feel to it versus when you build a city through CGI or you just shoot in like Chicago, right? Like, yeah, they don't do that anymore. But Blade Runner, do you know any film like today that you can watch and look at the city and say, hey, that's a really cool setting? Or Batman Returns, if you look at any movie today and say, hey, that's a really cool Gotham, or even Fifth Element, right? Like miniatures and set design, it's really effective. Like it really works.
No, I 100% agree. I think that as far as like the history of movies, I don't think there's ever been a more interesting, like crazy, like some scenes of this movie I'm like at a loss for words because it's like you're literally transported into a completely different reality, and it's one of those things where like I come back and watch this movie over and over and over again, and I always notice new things because the amount of detail that's in this film in each and every scene is absolutely like staggering. And like if you like, I don't know if you've seen like the documentary of the making of this thing, but dude, you talk about guys putting out the best work they can, and like there's something about like 80s filmmaking where it's like I don't know what was in the air, but like these guys were like trying to outdo one another. I don't know if it was the fact that, you know, the Cold War and people were thinking the world was gonna end, so let me try to make this the best films I can before the world ends. But it's like Jesus, I don't know what sort of what was in the air, but like it's just it's staggering because I think a lot of it comes too from the designer of like all this concept art, Sid Mead. I think he adds a lot to anything he touches, because this guy's artwork and his concept design and everything he does and everything that's in this movie, everything has a purpose. Like,
Yeah, it has a purpose, and it's also there's longevity to it, right? Like if you were to give me a statue that was made in 20 years, that statue that was made, the craftsmanship is still going to be the same. But if you were to show me like a CGI model of that statue, in 20 years, a newer CGI model of that statue would look even better, right? And then the older CGI version would look horrible, right? So it's almost, and I mean, aside from that, the CGI is always going to look, it's always going to feel fake because it is, right? Whereas the set design, the craftsmanship, the aesthetics, that stuff is real. So even if you shoot it a certain way and you kind of like, you know, play with the color grading, and the film kind of shows you like a more fantastical version of what they were actually doing in real life, right? You're not going to know the difference because it's still like stone and wood and metal, like it's an actual tangible thing, you know? Like you could feel that it's tangible even if it's presented as certain.
yeah, there's an authentic boy. That last battle they had in that apartment complex, and the rain, and the way that it looked, because there's an interesting look that Blade Runner has, where it combines like old like Victorian style like housing with like crazy like neon lights, and it's like a weird combination that I felt was kind of not really in the new one. They kind of, for like the new Blade Runner, they kind of just sort of didn't really have the same feel. I think it only came through in a couple scenes, but I think that's part of the reason why I didn't really enjoy it as much. But you know what? It's a tricky thing to do, because like you kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if Blade Runner 2049 came out and it looked too similar to the original, people will say, "Hey, well, he's just copying what was done before." But you know, you go the other way, and it's like, "Oh, it doesn't feel like Blade Runner." So it's a testament to how much work was put into the world building and the design, because no one can really live up to it. I mean, I don't think anyone has ever created something.
You can't, because it was the first to do something. You know what
It
I mean?
was
Like,
it was the first. It was the
the
first. Yeah.
first one. Yeah, like so you're never. I mean, you might do a variation of what it did, but you're still doing a variation of what it. It's like when you look at Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee, right? Yeah, Jackie Chan does his own thing, but he's a variation of what Bruce Lee did in film, right? He just made it more comedic and more like a dance, whereas Bruce Lee was more like the serious approach, right? But you're not going to be Bruce Lee. Similarly, like you could be doing Fifth Element, you could be doing RoboCop, you could be doing even The Matrix, right? You could be doing The Matrix, but Blade Runner is still that first film. When you talk about like science fiction films, that kind of went there. And then before Blade Runner, you had I think before Blade Runner, maybe after. Did Blade Runner come out after 2001: A Space Odyssey, or did 2001: Space Odyssey come out before Blade Runner?
I believe it came out afterwards, because I think 2001, I think, was like late 70s, if I'm not mistaken.
Because that was the one that really did science fiction from like the space perspective, but then Blade Runner was the one that kind of really did the world building cyberpunk type of science fiction, where it's like with the set design and with the buildings and that kind of thing. And it's funny when you were mentioning that final scene between Roy and Deckard. You know, the scene that came to my mind is, you remember in the first Matrix, Agent Smith and Neo are fighting, and they're fighting in the subway, and there's a scene where he puts him up against the wall, and there's the CGI where he has the multiple arms and the punch is so fast, and he's kind of like pummeling him into the brick wall. Like,
Yeah.
do you remember that? Like where he's like open, like his midsection's open, and Agent Smith just like unloads on him, right? I think that was like the last, like when I think of like moments in films, right? That was the last moment in a film where I felt it was a combination of practical effects and real set design and CGI. Because The Matrix was in the film that really pushed us into like full-on CGI, and now everything was copying The Matrix. And still to this day, I think everything is copying The Matrix, because that was the first film that really went into like the 21st century CGI movie making, right?
Look, man, we can have a whole discussion about Matrix, because
like,
that was a wild film.
That's what sets the first Matrix apart from the other two, and probably this fourth one, is that it was like they had the CGI technology, right? And it was ushering in a new age of like CGI movie making, which to this day is influenced by The Matrix. But it was like that middle ground when they were when filmmaking and films were shifting from practical effects and set design and like wire work and that type of stuff to CGI computer generated action scenes in movies, right? And you saw it a little bit more with the second, with Matrix Reloaded, but it still had some practical elements, right? And then you saw it like full on CGI in the third Matrix, and now like almost every movie that comes out is full on CGI. But I think that's where we lost something. I think we gained something because the technology is very helpful in certain situations, but I think we lost something because it shouldn't have ever gone. Like, essentially, The Matrix was the pinnacle of science fiction action filmmaking, right?
Oh,
like
100%.
You had T2, you had Matrix 1, Blade Runner, like, you know, Batman Returns, all these types of films, RoboCop.
If you're talking about the most, if you ask me, hey, what is the most definitive film in sci-fi that has come out in the last 15, 20 years, I'll say Matrix, easy.
Yeah, but at the pinnacle, The Matrix was a product of two worlds, right? Like, it had 1 foot in CGI and 1 foot in practical effects. So it was like the perfect balance. And then after The Matrix, things just went out of balance because they just became 100% CGI. So it was like,
it's because they like the Wachowski brothers, they or sisters now. What they understood is that you can do what you can do until you can't, and that's when they use CGI. Because like everything in that movie was such a well-balanced movie, man. Like, top to bottom, it is probably one of the most well-balanced films ever created. Like, you don't just make that by accident. Like, you have to really understand what you're doing and know, okay, well, this is what we're gonna have to ultimately use CGI just for this particular scene. We'll have to use it because we cannot do this any other way. And I think that's the difference.
But is like a perfect example, right? When they went into, I think it was Matrix 2, where there was multiple Agent Smiths. Do you remember where Neo's in like the playground or something? I
remember that scene. And, like PS2,
like
man.
Or a bird, and then there's like one Agent Smith shows up, and then a bunch of
PS2 graphics, man.
Yeah. So like when you watch that scene where Neo's fighting multiple multiple Agent Smiths, right? The idea and the concept of there being like an infinite amount of Agent Smiths, that's interesting, right? Like, that's an interesting idea. And the idea of Neo like masterfully taking all of them on, like with martial arts, that's also an interesting idea, right? But the fact that execution of that idea is 100% CGI, right away, it not only outdates the whole thing, but it kind of looked outdated the moment you saw it, right? Like, the moment you saw it in the theater, you knew it was CGI, right? Because you're looking at the bodies fly and all this stuff, and you're like, okay, this is clearly CGI. But do you remember the scene earlier in Matrix 2 where they're having like a secret meeting, and there's a knock on the door, and the two agents appear, and Neo fights those two agents, and they're like only human or something like that, and he takes on those two guys? That scene felt more powerful because it was like real stuntmen, right? It wasn't CGI. Like, it was 2-on-1, but it was 2-on-1 where it was a little bit more realistic, like the first Matrix, right? So it's like if you were gonna do a scene where there's like more than one Agent Smith, and they're taking on one Neo, right? Which I guess to choreograph something like that would be insane, right? But if you chose not to execute it 100% CGI and you said we're gonna have a balance of practical effects and CGI, but the way we'll do it is, get a bunch of stuntmen, we'll have the actual fight choreographed, we'll do the actual fight, and then we'll like CGI like the face, right? We'll CGI all the faces to make it look like Agent Smith, right? Like that's something where you're combining your CGI technology with realistic practical effects, actual people, where yeah, maybe then during that chaos and choreography, you can throw in a couple CGI Agent Smiths to make the numbers look even bigger. You won't notice it as much. I think Lord of the Rings did something like that, where it was like a combination of photo, CGI, and realistic people, but they made the numbers look bigger, right? So it's like you could approach it a different way, but the way the Wachowskis approached it was they fully leaned on the CGI, right? Like they fully. And I think that's why the industry went where it went, because the ones that really ushered in this age of CGI were the Wachowskis, right? And they created the CGI technology, right? James Cameron wasn't really using CGI. I mean, he used it, for the liquefying stuff, right? But his films were largely practical effects, right? Like he never really went, like full CGI. Like that was the Matrix and Matrix 2 and Matrix 3.
Until Avatar.
And yeah, so I think if they had approached it as a balance between the two, it would have been more interesting, because you could watch Blade Runner, the original, and watch Blade Runner 2049, and the original doesn't seem outdated.
Oh, no way. Yeah, I think, well, you just said it. I mean, when you use, like, practical effects, not only do you get, like, a better sort of feeling of, like, authenticity in the world, and, like, even the actors respond better to it because they're actually there. But, I mean, like, it stands the test of time, and, I think the problem now is that, like, we've gotten to the point where, like, this stuff is not easy anymore. And if you wanted to do a movie like Blade Runner today, there's no way it would happen. It would not be the same product. And I think having restrictions based on technology, really, it brought out the best in whoever was making films, because, like, you had to figure it out. You had to put in the work. So, I mean, this is a whole, other topic, but I think it all ties in, because to me, I think, like I said earlier, I don't really get tired of watching this film because it literally is incredible to watch. Like every single set, every single detail, every single little button or little doodad you see in the background, everything is all made. Even the way that the cars looked. Like you could see, like they completely modeled the interiors of all the cars. Like the crazy amount of detail that they went into for this film, I don't think nothing has even come close to it. And I don't know how he did it. Like I have no idea like what kind of crazy situation Ridley Scott's mind was in. I don't know if it's coming off Alien or I don't know how he did it. But it's like,
well, I think the guy, I think by the time he became a filmmaker, he was really old by the time he became a filmmaker. Like he had already had a career as, I think it was interior design or architecture or something. He was something involved in designing something architecturally or interior design type of stuff.
That makes a lot of sense.
If I'm not mistaken. And he was already very like successful at that. Like he was very wealthy and successful at that, and then he just decided to go into filmmaking at that point. So I think he's always had that skill set to make things look good. Like when it comes to designing sets, when it comes to lighting, when it comes to like things being perfect. Like he has a very, very good visual eye, right?
Oh man, like if we talk about like a crazy visual, like the last sequence of Alien when the ship is about to explode and Sigourney Weaver is like avoiding the alien, and the visuals in that sequence are outrageous.
Yeah, and like if you think about it, right? Like the first Alien, right? That was the one that was more like horror, right? It was more horror. Nobody in space can hear you scream or whatever, right? And the second Aliens was more like action adventure, James Cameron, right? But when you think of the first Aliens being like a horror film, it's the same type of thing when you look at not 2001: A Space Odyssey in a sense of that wasn't a horror film, right? But 2001: A Space Odyssey took place. The setting was a spaceship, right?
I would disagree. I would think 2001 can be categorized as a horror film. There are some horrifying sequences in that film.
Yeah, and then I was gonna mention The Shining.
It's weird because it's not scary, but psychologically it's scary.
It's scary in a like, what if this was the situation type of thing. Like it's scary in like the idea of what if artificial intelligence was smart and there was this conflict between human beings and an AI, right? Like, so it's kind of scary in the idea of it, right? Even though it's not like your jump scare type of horror film, right? Like your blood and guts, like jump scare type of film. But when you look at like 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Shining, and then Alien, they take place in a setting, right? So like, The Shining was more like genre horror, but that was like a hotel. 2001: A Space Odyssey was a ship, and then Aliens was a ship. So then you look at, okay, well, what makes the difference between Alien and 2001: A Space Odyssey, and what makes Alien more effective? And I don't necessarily want to make the statement that Ridley Scott did a better visual job than Stanley Kubrick with 2001: A Space Odyssey, because I don't think that's what it is. I think he lit it more like a horror film, and he shot it more in a way that was effective for horror, right? Like the first Alien, it's a dark movie, and you don't see the alien half the time, but everything is lit a certain way, and everything looks a certain way, and everything like the idea of the ship and the idea of what's in a corner, what's not in the corner, like what's above you or what's below you, what's not above you, what's not below you, like the idea like that the acid can go through, like like a drop of acid from the alien can go through like multiple levels of the ship, right? Like that's a crazy idea.
I mean, it goes back to what we were saying, man. Like, the guy is a visual storyteller. He'll show you something and let your mind do the rest.
What was that? Was that Alien 1 or was that Alien 2? Do you remember the scene that I'm talking about where like the acid fell?
Oh yeah, that was Alien 1.
The way down. It was Alien 1. Okay.
Yeah. So I think, we've talked about Blade Runner, so we should probably talk about the sequel, because I think a lot of people have said that they actually believe the sequel is a better film, and I want to know what you think, because like I have my own opinion and I'll get into it, but I want to know like sort of your overall feeling on 2049 and how it sort of fits into this whole universe of Blade Runner, and if you could think of any way that it could have been better. But yeah, I'll let you take the floor on this one.
So I'm a huge fan of Blade Runner 2049. I think it's the only film that I've seen from Villeneuve, or Villeneuve, I don't know how to say his name, but Villeneuve, that I can say I'm a fan of and that I like, and I like it more than the original Blade Runner. And it neither the original Blade Runner and neither Blade Runner 2049 is the full potential of what I see thematically in Blade Runner, like the intellectual property, right? So neither one is what I would like ideally, but I like Blade Runner 2049 better, and I think that's because, to me, ideally, if the story was done in the ideal way, to me it would focus thematically on the idea of the detective not knowing who's a replicant and who's not, and paranoia, and the idea of a chase, and the idea of a hunt, and the cat and mouse, and the back and forth. And
it's interesting you bring that up. It's interesting you bring that up, because I really, like, when they first announced a sequel to Blade Runner, I thought would be what the movie would be about. Like we're following a new Blade Runner, and for whatever reason, we're showing him going through the same process that Harrison Ford did, but for whatever reason, he's, they're showing it in more full detail because we never got to see really how these guys operate in the movie. We got to see what Harrison Ford handled it, but we never really got an in-depth look into like how this division of the police force dealing with this crazy situation actually functioned.
But that I think that's also another interesting point you make, right? Because when you compare Blade Runner to Blade Runner 2049, to me, I think another strength of Blade Runner 2049 is that it has a more tangible representation of the police force, right? Like you know there's a police force in the original Blade Runner. The captain, his name is Brian, right? You see him like meet with Deckard in his office. Then you see him meet with Deckard when he drives up after he kills the first replicant, and he tells him, there's 4 more replicants, and he's like, what do you mean 4 more? There's 3 more. And he goes, no, there's 4 because the Rachel, she left the Tyrell Corporation, and now you gotta bring her in, right? Because she's disappeared. So the police force is there. You see the cars, you see the other agents, you see the captain, right? But it's not as in focus, because when you watch Blade Runner 2049, the police, they feel more in focus. You got the female captain, which he has more scenes with and he has more interactions with. You have him going back to the headquarters when he does that baseline test, and he fails the baseline test, and then she says, you have 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever it is to leave without your badge, and then come back and you have to pass the baseline test. But you felt more of a presence, right? And you felt more of a presence of that police force in the new Blade Runner than the original Blade Runner. And I think that adds to why I like it so much, because again, to me, Blade Runner is a detective story. Not even a detective story. Like, have you seen Will Smith in iRobot?
Oh yeah, that was a good movie.
Yeah, and because that's also based on Isaac Asimov, the iRobot story. So it's like he's a detective and there's a homicide and he's solving the crime, and it's a futuristic setting, right? And even the Fifth Element, Corbin Dallas, he's like military or like a cop or something, right? And he's giving an assignment and he has to do the assignment, right? But it's the idea of that is the story. Like, to me, that is the story. Like, this is a detective cyberpunk film noir story. So I don't really need to see elements of like this what do you call it, where Blade Runner, the original one, is like questioning, like philosophically, like what is the identity of a replicant, and then Blade Runner 2049 is doing the opposite, which is it just reverses it, and it's like philosophically, like what is the identity of this detective? Is he a replicant? Is he not a replicant? So it's like they're both dealing with themes of identity, right? Like identity in the sense of what's it mean to be a replicant, and identity in the sense of am I a replicant or am I not a replicant? But to me, you don't need to go that deep. Like, the deep stuff is good if it's there, but you just need to deal with the theme of identity of here's an individual detective and here's a group of replicants, or here's a headhunter and here's the hunted, or here's the hunted and there's the hunter, right? Like, do what the Matrix did, right? Like, the Matrix, the first one, is very simple because the world philosophically is already complicated. You have all the imagery there, you have all the themes there. You don't need to focus on them. You don't need to like overtly state them in the dialogue. Like, it's kind of underneath, right? Like, it's underneath, and in the first Matrix, all that stuff is there, but it plays as a simple like action film of like getting out of the Matrix or becoming the one, right? Like, that's a very simple narrative, even though it's layered with all the stuff underneath. When they got to Matrix 2 and then they got to Matrix 3, they start focusing on all the stuff underneath, And it's like, no, like that's a huge mistake, and that's what they started doing with the Blade Runners. That's what they do with some of those films. You have to do it like how James Cameron did it with Terminator, right? Like all that stuff is there. Yes, we know philosophy, the themes, robots versus humanity, like what does it mean to be a robot? What does it mean to be a human? Like all that stuff is underneath. But James Cameron doesn't spend the film focusing on those philosophical questions, right? He just treats it as an action film, right? Like the archetype of, a Terminator, a T2 that's a protector, another one that's like a hunter, right? Like, I think that's the ideal, and I think Blade Runner 2049 is closer to that than the original Blade Runner, but I feel like they both make the same mistake of focusing on the opposite ends of like the philosophical question of like the identity of a replicant. But because you have more of the police force in the second Blade Runner, it like grounds it more, because you know how a police department works, right? So when he goes into the police department, when she's having conversations with him in the office, and she's a captain and she's a detective, that's a very cliche, archetypical trope, right? Like even iRobot, like, any film with a detective, they always go to the, commissioner's office, or they always go to like the lieutenant's office, right? And they're always having that conversation. So it's like, that's like very familiar imagery. So because that's familiar imagery and it's simple, it kind of like anchors your story. So I felt that Blade Runner 2049 was more anchored, and the original Blade Runner was a little bit more abstract, which isn't bad, right? Like sometimes, like you said, those philosophical questions are interesting, right? Especially when you're such a visual filmmaker, right? To have it be like open-ended like that. But I like a little bit more of like the traditional, stereotypical like story. Like this is a detective, this is the mission, these are like the plot points, right? And I felt visually Blade Runner 2049 I felt was good. Like
oh no, it was good. It was good. It was just
good. Like
it was just a different style, because I think that Villeneuve basically said in an interview, like, it's like an artist doing a painting from another artist in his own style. So it's like there were parts of the movie that I was like, wow, this really does feel like an extension of the original Blade Runner. And there were parts of the movie where I'm like, this feels like a completely different world.
Well, what did you like the most? Because like there's, how everybody, when they talk about like I think it was Roger Deakins that did the cinema. Was it Roger Deakins that did Blade Runner? I think it was.
I believe so, yeah.
And everybody talks about like the that scene, I forget what scene it is, where you see it, where he's going through it's like an orange and golden red hue, and he's like it's this scene, I don't know if it's a desert, I don't remember where it is.
Oh, you talking about when he went to Las Vegas?
I think so, yeah. And it's like everything's very bright and orange, and a lot of people, when they talk about the cinematography, they look at that scene, but there's scenes when he's in the police station where everything's very like dark and contrasted. Like his outfit's very dark and the background's very light, which is also interesting cinematography. So it was like, you remember how in the original Blade Runner, when the skyscraper has that like girl on it, that advertisement, and
the geisha girl?
The geisha girl, and then the new Blade Runner, he has that like hologram AI with him, and then she's like
yes.
like this giant version. It kind of looked like a play on that, right? Like he's using the same type of imagery, just a little differently. But what did you feel really worked? Because I thought that whole like using like I forget what the name of the character is, but he has this like AI that's kind of like his love interest, and he's kind of like a person or a character that's alone, but it's like the way that it's contrasted between the way that Ryan Gosling is acting the character, right, and the way that the hologram is like this technology that's kind of like it's like meeting that like lack in his life, I guess, metaphorically speaking, right? Like he doesn't have relationships, but he's involved with his technology, right? I thought that was very interesting. That wasn't necessarily in the first Blade Runner.
Yeah, it did a lot of interesting things. Especially that whole relationship he had with the AI. Because so you have on one side a person who is essentially um, basically grown in a lab, essentially, and another person who exists on a completely different plane, but does not have a physical body, and it's kind of like almost like the mind and the body, and having a body and mind, and that whole idea of what makes a person a person. And I think that goes right back into the original Blade Runner, because can you imagine if someone like downloaded your mind into a computer? You no longer have your body, but you're still you, and you can project yourself as. This even goes into the Matrix, man. Like the whole concept of digital self. And I think that was a really interesting dynamic, because they didn't really explore a lot of that stuff in the first film. It was more of just like surface level, but I really liked that stuff, and I think that's what the strength of the movie really was. And I think the problem I had was that like all these ideas that were in 2049, they were all grand ideas, and they all could have been their own movie and could have been like a classic if they had really gone into all of it. But I feel like maybe he just kind of ran out of time. But I don't know if you got that feeling, but I felt like there was a lot of plot lines in that film that kind of reached dead ends. Especially,
I feel like it would benefit from a sequel. Like it would benefit if instead of one movie he had two movies to kind of flesh some of those ideas out. I think
you know, it
because there
felt
was a
like
lot of
that.
stuff in there.
It felt like this was a part one, because like,
Yeah,
do you remember when he was figuring out who the he discovers like this whole underground army of like replicants, and they were talking about early on in the film, they were talking about how it breaks the wall between humans and replicants, and there was gonna be this giant war between humankind and the replicant kind. And obviously the replicants would win that war, which is a scary thing to think about, because they're faster than us, they're stronger than us, they're smarter than us, they're genetically engineered to be perfect. So I think that whole concept of like human beings being outdone by their own creation is like a crazy concept, man. And like they were setting that up, and I was expecting there to be like this whole like battle scene at the end, but it didn't really come to pass. And I felt like there was a lot of aspects in the film that didn't come to pass. They hinted at seeing Off-World, which I think would have been a crazy thing to see, because they always talked about Off-World. You know, how it's basically where all the rich people go. And that would have been a nice thing to see, because they were actually going there at the end of the film with Harrison Ford. They were taking him off-world. You never got to see it. So I think ultimately, like, yeah, go ahead.
It leaves room for like a continuation. Yeah.
There was so much that he laid on the table that was, oh man, and it was great ideas. But I think one of the biggest issues I had was the fact that they made the main character a side character.
And that's so crazy because and by the main character you mean Kay, right?
Yes, they were setting up Kay to be an interesting character, because he was supposed to be the one, I think. And I think when they made it the other person, it kind of sucked the life out of the storyline for me, because I'm like, if anyone deserved to have that sort of redemption, I think it would have been Kay, because like it just felt to me like the way they ended, and he's kind of reunited Harrison Ford with his daughter at the end. And it just sort of had this sort of somber ending where he was just sort of dying. And to me, the movie ended in a way that I felt where only a few movies I felt this way. Like, I felt like nothing was accomplished.
Yeah, and especially. So would you say that you agree that it started off like from the perspective of Agent K as a character, right? That it started off stronger in the first half of the film versus where the second half of the film went. At least
100%.
just in regards to his character.
100%. The second they announced, the second he realized that he wasn't the one, I think the movie started to fall down.
It also becomes a little bit less interesting, because that was like the big question, right? Whether he was the one or he wasn't the one, and you kind of want to see where that goes. But it's kind of like, even if you don't see where it ends up, the ambiguity of it is still kind of interesting, right? Like, what if he died and you don't find out if he
That's
was
what I'm saying, because that's
if he was or if he
something.
wasn't, you know?
That's something that is such an interesting thing because it would tie so good back into the original Blade Runner. Human versus non-human, you can't tell. So it would have been such an interesting way of ending it, whereby like, what if he wasn't the one, but because of his own sort of mindset,
Relief, yeah.
he kind of became the one. And I think it would have sort of blurred the lines between being human and replicant, because if you can sort of become human, that was the entire sort of linchpin of what was Blade Runner, because that was an interesting idea they had, whereby they made Rachel able to have children, which I think was one of the most interesting things they could have done. The second I heard that, I was like, oh, this is gonna be good, man. Because you create so many interesting situations just by having that concept. And he only really touched upon it and sort of left it there. And I think, I don't know, I mean, I feel like maybe it was just too much, not enough time, not enough resources or money, but that's the thing I like about the original though. It feels like a complete film. When you watch Blade Runner from beginning to end, the way it ends, it has one of the most satisfying endings in any movie ever. Every character has their arc, especially if you watch the original cut. I don't know if have you seen the original cut where it shows what happens.
I've seen the director's cut, so I don't know if that's the original. Or if that's not the original, but I've seen the director's cut.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like the original cut theatrical, but I like the theatrical because it shows a scene where like Deckard and Rachel are in a car and they're speeding off into like the wilderness, and it's the first time you see the sunlight in the entire movie, and it kind of, it gives a really nice contrast because you've been in the dark rain the entire movie, and it sort of like has this first moment of like happiness, and it didn't really it doesn't add that much to the film, but I think for me, I like that particular ending better than just having it end on that rooftop. It adds a little bit more to it.
Like the scope of, you get to see like another side of the world, essentially.
Yeah, man, and I believe they use footage from The Shining. Like, you know, in the beginning of The Shining when you see like that forest and the trees and the roads and everything?
Yes, when they're going to the hotel.
Yeah, it uses a scene from that to show that they kind of escaped the city and they're now going into the and it ties so good back into like 2049 because that's what happened. They left the city and they went and had a life.
Yeah, and you know, it's a little bit of a shame because I feel like one of the strongest elements of Blade Runner 2049 is that they have Ryan Gosling cast as Agent K. And you know, I think when you look at the original Blade Runner and you look at like the performances, and then you look at the performances of and I think Blade Runner 2049 ends with Agent K dies and Harrison Ford goes into the place with the daughter. He reunites with the daughter or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, you're right, that does end up sidestepping his character in a way, right? Like in a big way. But when I think of actors, I can't think of anybody since Michael Keaton that's a quiet actor. And I think more like in this generation, more than any other actor, the only actor that I can think of in anything he does that's a quiet actor is Ryan Gosling. Like, you have scenes in the original Blade Runner where Roy, you know, is having all these scenes where he's going through all this dialogue, right? And you have these, and he does a great job with the dialogue. But then you have, you know, scenes where Harrison Ford's character has his moments and you're like, it's okay, right? But the thing with like a Michael Keaton or a Ryan Gosling is there are moments in Blade Runner 2049 where Ryan Gosling is not saying anything, right? He's just giving you a look, and the look is saying everything, right? And it's a subtle look, and like, you know, I'm thinking there's so many moments, but I'm thinking of the moment. You remember where ship goes down and then he kind of snaps out of it, and then people are circling the ship, or they're approaching him, and he starts like picking people off. there's this look on his face that is literally like, oh shit, right? And he has so many subtle looks like that. You know, when someone's talking to him, or Harrison Ford's talking to him, or then they get into a fist fight, or when he's doing the baseline test, and you know, there's the scene where he passes the baseline test, and there's the scene where he fails the baseline test, right? But when you're an actor that's a quiet actor, right? And like, let's say his emotions are bottled inside, and it's a very like subtle performance where you're not using a lot of words. When you do get to the moment, like, you remember the moment where he fails the baseline? No, it's not when he fails the baseline test. It's the moment before he fails the baseline test, where she's looking at the memory, and he realizes that it's a real memory, and he kind of throws the chair, and he has that angry outburst.
Yes, I do remember that scene.
So it's great because he's so good at having a quiet performance and bottled emotions that when he gets to the angry moment and he erupts with the emotions, it's a great release. But then the scene right after that is the scene where he fails his baseline test, right? So you see like this actor portraying this character in a very subtle, nuanced way, where you see the performance like you do with Keaton through like the eyes and through the face and through like subtle movements. He gets to a moment where he explodes with anger, and then the very next scene is him trying to like reestablish his control and his baseline to where he's not showing that emotion, right? So he's trying to give you like the same performance, but a little bit with the emotion underneath, because he did just have this like break in his psyche and this break of emotion, and he's not as controlled, so he ends up failing the baseline test, right? But it's that performance to me that, if I had to boil it down, like, why do I like Blade Runner 2049 over the original Blade Runner? I could go into a million different things, but essentially it's because they have Ryan Gosling cast as Agent K, and the original one doesn't have that. So to me, that makes the whole difference. Like, that's essentially, to me, Blade Runner 2049 is Ryan Gosling's performance as Agent K. And I think the third act, where they sidestep his character and they kind of focus it in on Harrison Ford and his daughter, which is like a very, you could say it's a very different story than where it started, right? That's not where it started at all. That was a little disappointing. I do think the first half of Blade Runner 2049 is much stronger than the second half. But he had a great moment with that female replicant where they're drowning, and he ends up, I think he strangles her, but he ends up defeating her, and then he dies because he had like a wound or something like that. I think she shot him or something. But
that woman that was in that movie, I don't know her name, but something about her performance in that movie was extremely good. Like, she was extremely good, but she ended up making you feel she was the main villain. I completely don't even remember Jared Leto as the attack in this, which is horrible for his acting, because I'm talking about a whole film. The only memory I have of the guy is the trailer, where you see him and the replicant is born and he's like the creator. Like, that's the only memory I have of Jared Leto. If you were to ask me, like, what is his character, like, what do you remember of him in Blade Runner 2049? I don't remember anything. Like, not at all. I remember her character, I remember Ryan Gosling, I remember Harrison Ford, I remember the police, lieutenant, her character, I remember, like, the holographic character, that scene where he, like, sleeps with, like, the prostitute replicant, and he pretends that it's the AI. That was
AI or whatever it is.
Listen, man, I don't know.
Where they kill the AI, where that female replicant ends up killing the little whatever it is that he has that she's like connected to, right? So she like kills her or whatever.
I just want to back up real quick because I forgot completely.
I remember everything, but I don't remember Jared Leto at all. It's like amnesia.
The thing is, like, if you look at the way that he's performing, clearly he knows he's in a top tier film. And he knows the way that characters talk in Blade Runner. Because do you remember the way that Roy was talking in Blade Runner? All poetic and saying this and that?
Yeah.
He knew what he was in. I just think that for whatever reason, he went way too far with it, and
I don't
he
remember.
over.
Like, refresh my memory. Like, what did he do? Like, what were his scenes? I don't remember any of it.
Well, from what I understood, he was supposed to be sort of the because you remember how Tyrell Corporation sort of had that guy, and he got killed by the other guy. From what I understood, he was sort of like the inheritor of whatever Tyrell had left. So I got the impression that he was sort of like that young, arrogant son that inherited all this crazy wealth and technology. And the way this guy talked, man, it's like he had his own head up his ass. Like the way he was like talking about like all poetic, and because there was a scene where he was showing off a new model to the other woman, and he basically was talking about how humanity was essentially stuck on Earth, and he wanted to expand replicants to be interplanetary. So when he was saying, you know, 5 fingers, you can count the amount of planets on 5 fingers, or something like that. He was saying some crap he was saying. But anyway, I mean, I think the problem was Jared Leto's not a bad actor. He just needs to reel himself in sometimes, because I think he gets up his own ass a little bit every now and then, and I think that's what happened here.
Like, it grandioses the character so much that you don't even remember it.
Yeah, it's like he erased himself.
And you have 2 actors in the same film, and Ryan Gosling is like the example of like subtle nuance and like understated acting, and like Jared Leto is the like infamous example of overacting and overt, like everything over the top. And it's like the 2 of them are in the same movie, and I can remember minute facial expressions from Ryan Gosling in specific scenes, and I could play you back those scenes like moment to moment, even though it's so minor, right, and so subtle that you could miss it, but you don't, because it's like memorable. Whereas Jared Leto, it's so over the top that you would think you would never forget it, but you completely forget it because there's no like, whatever choices he's making as an actor, they're the wrong choices. Like, there's no depth to the choice, there's no impact to the emotion, like there's no memorability to the performance. So it's like he's doing all these like broad stroke like big things, but there's no depth to those big things. So
it's the difference, man.
That's the difference.
It's the difference in personalities behind the actor themselves, because Roy was talking like that too, but because Rutger Hauer was such a, I think it comes down to the personality, man. Because Rutger Hauer, like the stuff that this guy was doing back then, man, like the fact that he came up with that entire dialogue on his own.
Well, it's the same idea with you know, because oh my god, like you know, Jared Leto just has like horrible end of the stick, because he was in Blade Runner with Ryan Gosling, which is an understated actor, right, that does it as good as anybody, and that kind of shows his flaws. And now he's in House of Gucci with Al Pacino, who's the prime example of how to do over the top the correct way, right? So now it's going to show his flaws in that sense, because I've heard he's getting bad reviews for his performance. But
damn, I didn't even hear about that.
Perfect example, Al Pacino, right? When you watch Scarface, Tony Montana is as over the top a character as you can find in like cinema history, right? But when Al Pacino plays Tony Montana in Scarface, and it's over the top, and it's like grandiose and exaggerated and swinging for the fences, but there's a depth to it that, like, there's quiet moments too, and then there's moments where he's over the top, but even his over the top moments come from a very specific character, right? So it's like, it's memorable because it's so unique that you know the personality of Tony Montana, right? So it's like, yeah, he's over the top, yeah, it's bombastic performance, it's chewing the scenery, yeah, like it's this huge grandiose thing, but it's so specific in the broad strokes that you're like, but that character of Tony Montana is like well realized. Like it's almost like he has a book, right? And that book of his character work is like 50 pages, and he's done the 50 pages, and he knows the whole history of the character, and now he's giving you like 3 pages that are the loudest pages, but you know there's a 50 other pages that he's aware of that's underneath it, right? So you know, like, the weight of the performance, right? So, and you know, he did the same thing in The Irishman. Like, his character in The Irishman was a little bit chewing the scenery, but it still worked in a very like empathetic way when it needed to, right? So I think that's the difference. I think Jared Leto does the over-the-top performance, but those 3 pages he's giving you is actually the only 3 pages of character work he has. There is no 50 other pages. Like, he's done 3 pages, he's giving you those 3 pages, whereas Al Pacino, he's done 100 pages, and he's giving you maybe like 20 pages. But you know there's more page, like, you know what I'm saying? It's like when Tarantino writes a script and he makes a movie. He wrote this novel, and you know there's all these scenes that didn't make it into the film, but even though they didn't make it into the film, you feel that there's another 20 pages of narrative and history and character work and settings and plot points that aren't in the film, but you get the sense that they exist somewhere, right? So
Exactly.
so it feels real. Like, Tony Montana feels very real. His character, I forget who he played in The Irishman, but the character Hoffa, Tony Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, or something like that, feels very real, even though it was a real person. But Jared Leto's characters, they don't. I mean, it's like a hot air balloon, right? Like, it's this huge hot air balloon in the sky, and you see it for 2 seconds, and you're like, wow, that's a really big hot air balloon. But then you realize it's like just full of hot air. There's nothing to it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it to, like, because the same character in the original Blade Runner, Tyrell himself, like,
Was
the
more
way,
interesting.
yeah, he didn't say as much, but I guess it has to do with the way that he approached these things, because the way he was done in the original, they put him in this tower, they surrounded him in all this like luxurious settings and everything, and the fact that, like, this guy he made you play a chess game before he would even talk to you.
Yeah.
And you had to beat him.
There's this funny scene when Roy kills him, right? And it's funny because the way the actor plays it, right? Like, you could say, like, the way Ridley Scott presents, was his name Tyrell? Dr. Tyrell? What was his full name? Just Tyrell, right?
Tyrell, yeah.
So he was like the genius that made everybody, and I guess Jared Leto's supposed to be something similar. He's supposed to be a genius that's like created this new version of replicants, right? But the thing is, with Jared Leto, you don't buy into his performance. With the guy that was playing Tyrell, it's funny because it's a combination of Ridley Scott and it's a combination of the actor. And the way that I can describe it best, right, is normally that type of, like, overt, grandiose, eating the scenery that an actor like Al Pacino can do, that type of performance is very visual. So when an actor's playing, like, Scarface, Tony Montana, and he's so, like, over the moon overt and exaggerated, it's a visual element to the film. It's like a firecracker, right? When you think of Scarface, you think of the visual moments of Tony Montana with the machine gun, say hello to my little friend, his looks with the cocaine on the desk, his interactions with his friend and his girlfriend. It's a very, like, picturesque character. It's exaggerated, right? But Scarface is a very visually, like, normal film. Like, it's not science fiction. Like, yeah, De Palma has a lot of visual elements to his filmmaking, right? So that's there, but it's essentially the real world. When you look at Blade Runner, Ridley Scott is a very visual filmmaker, not that De Palma's not, but this is now science fiction. So when you see Tyrell's character, it's like the actor has the acting style of a Michael Keaton or a Ryan Gosling. It's a very quiet actor, right? So you have the quiet actor, but he's also like the statue, the statue of the man. He's kind of small, right? He's kind of this small guy. So you have this quiet performance and this type of minuscule actor, not minuscule, but compared to everybody else. And then you have Ridley Scott's visuals. So when they first go into Tyrell Corporation and he first meets Rachel, like that's Ridley Scott at his peak. You got the sunset coming up. You see
That
like the
scene was
grandeur of
crazy.
the office, and they start interacting, and then the greatest thing is Deckard's interacting with Rachel, right? And they're having this interaction, and Tyrell, this little man with these huge glasses, comes out from the shadows, right? And he's literally in the shadows, and he comes out of the shadows, and he starts questioning Deckard, and he's like, "You're trying to give her the test to see if she's a replicant," and they start having an interaction, and Deckard says something, and Tyrell says, "No, I want you to, like," he said, "I want you to show me this reaction, like show me this human reaction or this test."
Yeah, he's
right?
like, what's that gonna prove? And he's like, indulge me.
Indulge me, and he goes, "No, don't do it on me, do it with her," right? And then they do it, and they go through 100 questions, and Tyrell's like, usually how long does it take for you to figure out if someone's a replicant? He says about 20 to 30 questions.
The guy was like, he's like excited. He's like, oh, I want it. Oh,
yeah,
what's he think?
He's excited because he's like, how long it took 100 questions with her, right? And he's like, yeah, it took 100 questions. And he goes, yeah, because she's special. So it was almost like this little tiny man with these huge glasses. He was flexing a little bit.
He was flexing, 100%.
Like, he was flexing. He was like, oh, this is my work, and my work is different, right? Like you can't tell with this model in 20 or 30 questions if it's a replicant or not, right? So it's funny because later on when Roy shows up, this little character, so you have again you have this like grandiose setting. He's in this bed, he's got these robes, these lights, this like Ridley Scott architecture and this lighting. It's very like golden lighting and stark shadows, and like you said, the character, you have to play him in a chess game to go up. So he's playing that guy, the one that the replicants are get to help them out. That guy that's like 25 but he's older, or he seems older. And,
Sebastian, yeah.
Yeah, and he goes, I've only beaten him one time, right? So Roy is telling him the chess moves, and he gives him like 2 moves, and he has checkmate. So it's funny because the actor, in a very subtle way, you can see it in his performance, because he goes, oh, he makes one move, and he goes, that's a very peculiar move, and then the next move is checkmate, and he goes, oh, you've been thinking about some things. He goes, why don't you come up? Let's explore this. Why don't you come up? Let's explore this a little bit more. So then when they go up, originally in the first scene you see Tyrell, he was in the shadows, and he came out of the shadows. Now you see Roy is in the shadows, but you can see him through the door, like there's someone standing behind this other guy, and he started. The next line of dialogue out of his mouth is, "I thought you'd be here sooner," or something like that. But he's not talking to the guy; he's talking to Roy, who's in the shadows, right? So then Roy comes out. So again, this is the character. This is like this understated little guy who's supposed to be a genius, and you get the sense, visually, but through his performance too, that he already knows what's going on.
Yeah. I guess we could talk a bit about Fifth Element, because to me, I think it is like the last great like cyberpunk film, and it's an interesting one because it is a completely different tone from Blade Runner, but I feel it has a lot of the DNA still in it, as far as like where it came from and the idea behind it. So I mean, I haven't seen the film in a while, but it is probably one of the most enjoyable like cyberpunk movies, I think, as far as like entertainment value goes. Would you agree?
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it also still has that element where it blends, CGI with practical effects. There's that scene where they're chasing the Lilu character, and she's on the edge of the balcony, like on the skyscraper, and the cops are behind her, and he's telling her something like not to jump or whatever he's saying, and then he says, yeah, she doesn't understand like a word that I said, and then she jumps off and she crashes through the taxi for um, Dallas's character. I forget what the Dallas Corbin,
Uh-huh.
and it's that combination of, yeah, you're seeing like these floating police cars and taxis and this like Blade Runner-esque world, but when she crashes through the roof of the taxi, it's actual taxi. It's not like CGI. So it has like that blending of that balance that I was talking about between practical effects and CGI, but at the same time, it is a world that's directly influenced by Blade Runner, but the sensibility is a little bit more buoyant. It's a little bit more playful, right? Like you have Chris Tucker, you have, and Luc Besson, he also did Leon, right? Leon the Professional. So
That was a very
I
good
think,
film.
yeah, Leon the Professional, Fifth Element. So, I think he's also an original filmmaker. Some of his movies are interesting. Some of them, they're more like hit or miss. But it does feel within that like cyberpunk world, film noir world. You have what's his name as Dallas Corbin, Bruce Willis, right? You have Bruce Willis in that role. So, and even when when you talk about like female roles, you talk about like Sigourney Weaver, you talk about Linda Hamilton, but I think this character is also one of those characters too. Like the Lilu character, it's also very interesting as like a female performance in an action movie,
Yeah, I think one of the standouts of Fifth Element are the characters, and I mean like Chris Tucker's character is hilarious. Like one of the funniest, like that's probably like one of the funniest performances I've ever seen an actor do.
Yeah, it's a hilarious performance.
And like this all ties in because like none of this stuff like would even exist if Blade Runner wasn't around. Like the whole idea of a futuristic city, and I think like it's such a good template for like making other films that like if you look at the way that they took all the good stuff out of Blade Runner, but they did it their own sort of style and twist. You notice how like the city was always shown during the daytime for the most part. It's the complete opposite of what Blade Runner had, and I think that that combination with sort of that interesting art style it had. I'm not sure who did that, but like who was the concept artist behind this, but whoever it was did an exceptional job because nothing in that movie kind of really looked like it was copied and pasted from anything else. Everything had its own unique look to it.
Yeah, and everything is memorable. Like when you think about, oh God, what were those creatures that they could camouflage into different people, but they were actually like these creatures. They were like the bad guys, and then you had these creatures that were more of like I guess what was supposed to be like the angel race of creatures that had the secrets with the stones and the Fifth Element. But
Oh,
they're
at
like
the
these
beginning, yeah.
gigantic, like, yeah, they're like these gigantic, like it's what you wouldn't expect visually because you're thinking, oh, here's a priest and he's like worshiping these alien creatures, and these alien creatures are like protectors of the universe or whatever, and they have these like stones and fire, water, earth, and wind, and the Fifth Element, and when you see them show up, like they're these hulking, fat, like golden,
They can barely walk.
big-bodied, like little head, like creatures that can barely walk, and like they're little, like it's an interesting design, right? Let's just put it that way. Like it's an
The
interesting
part when
design
they're
for you.
the part when they're trying to like catch up to the door as it's closing, it's one of the funniest things. Like,
He's
go
like,
faster.
Yeah, he's like, you're not gonna make it. And he puts the key through the door. There's also this funny scene where they got that evil planet and it's growing bigger, and they put the force fields down. So then these like, I guess celestial, like good creatures, they're in their spaceship and they're coming through, and it's again, they're hulking creatures, and their spaceship is also hulking, but they're very slow, and you have these opposite enemy creatures that are the ones that are like in camouflage into different people, like those like gritty looking creatures, right? And they come in with these two little ships, and then they blow up the big ship, right? So it's kind of like funny in a sense of like, these are the good guys, or like the celestial beings or race or whatever they are, and they're very slow and hulking. And here come these, like, I guess the villainous creatures in two very small ships, and they like sneak through the force field because it's open, and they blow up the other creature's ship, and then the priest is like, "Oh, we're doomed," right? But it's so funny because you're like, but those guys were so slow to begin with. Like, where were they going? Like, they were like you kind of figure they were goners from the get-go, right? So there's and then that humor, I think, is what sets it apart from other films in a similar science fiction setting, is because there's a good balance of humor, like performance, acting, action. You have Lilu in the martial arts scenes that she does. You have Gary Oldman as Gorg, right? So there's the scene where
you know what's crazy about Gary? I did not know for many years that was Gary Oldman.
Yeah, he's wearing like a little headpiece, I think, or haircut. He looks different, but
when people told me that, I was like, "What are you talking about? He's not in that movie." And then I rewatched it. I was like, "Oh my god, man!"
Yeah, and there's the scene where he's talking about capitalism and like, look, here's the glass on my desk, and then he slides it off and it breaks, and all these little robots come out, and they're all cleaning it.
Yes.
He's like it's destruction, but then there's a ballet of life, and all these robots have a purpose, and all the mechanics that made these robots and all the engineers, they're gonna feed all their little kids, and all their little kids are gonna have some kind of life. And then he's choking on the cherry, the water. He's drinking water and he's choking on the cherry, and the priest, he's hitting all the buttons on his desk, and all these things are coming up, and this little like alien looking vacuum cleaner like type of thing on his desk is looking at him, like trying to help him from choking. And the priest is like, you have all this technology, all this riches, all these things, everything has a purpose, but not one of these things can help you from choking on a cherry. Or like, to pat him on the back so he doesn't choke. So the priest does it. But it's a funny scene where it's like, that's like the scene that separates like the darker science fiction from like an action adventure science fiction film that has dark elements, because Borg has some scenes later on where he has some darker elements, but it's the humor too. Like the Fifth Element can be very funny. It's a very funny movie, right?
I think that's the key, because I don't know a single person that does not like this film. And the thing about humor is that, man, you can, if you do humor correctly, you can pull in almost anybody. And I think that's part of why the Marvel movies are so successful, man. But I mean, the thing you said that's important is that it's a good balance. Like, you're watching the movie and you're like, this is funny, but it's not a joke. It's like, there's still stakes, there's still interesting action, there's a romance story, there's like great set pieces, there's great action. Like, this movie has so much in it that it literally checks every box, and it's still a good movie all around. And it's crazy because like, you don't really get a lot of movies like that anymore. And I think it's, as the years have gone by, it's become like a cult classic, man. And I think, it's really one of those sci-fi movies that you could put on like a Saturday night and just have a good time.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Chris Tucker's character where he's interacting with Bruce Willis. He's like, Dallas, my man, Dallas. He has the first interview, and he's like, as soon as he goes off the mic, he's like, look, that interview, that can't be how the interview is going to be tomorrow. Like, you have to give me more. And Dallas grabs him and says, I'm not giving you anything, blah blah blah. Like, like that whole straight man comedic dynamic. And then they have the interview with that blue alien that does like the singing that they're looking to get the stones from, and like Dallas Corbin is like the winner of this big like contest or whatever it is. So Chris Tucker talks a lot, right? He talks a lot. He's like flamboyant. It's comedic performance. He's on the mic, right? And then there's a moment where he gives the mic to Bruce Willis. Bruce Willis, he just says like, so are you excited to be here? And he says like one word in the most unexcited way you could deliver it,
He said it the way that Harrison Ford said the commentary at the end of Blade Runner.
Yeah, essentially. And then they end up having like the whole shootout where the general's like, I got my best man on it. He's gonna negotiate. He's gonna like not let things escalate, and he comes out with the machine gun and he's like blowing everybody up, and then he tells them like, these creatures, once you find out who the leader is and you kill the leader, the rest of them are like neutralized. They won't do anything. So the one leader, they find out who the leader is, and he asks for someone to negotiate with him or whatever, and then you see instead of like the priest, or instead of like Chris Tucker, you see Bruce Willis come around the corner with the machine gun. He's like, here's your negotiation, and he just like takes out the guy, and all the military guys are listening like, holy shit, like this is how this guy negotiates, like. But yeah, it's an interesting movie for what's her name too, that Russian actress that played Lelouch, that ended up doing all the Resident Evil movies.
Mia Jovovich. Yeah.
Jovovich. I think this is her. I don't know if this was her first big movie, but I know for a lot of years she's wanted to do a sequel to it. Like she wants to do this character again, but like that's a good role for like an intro movie, and she did a great job.
Yeah, no, she was good. She was good, man. I feel like her roles later on never really measured up, but yeah, I mean, honestly, like I can't think of a lot of sci-fi films that have that sort of level of, like, it's a consistent level of entertainment the whole way through. Like there's not a single moment that's boring in the entire movie, and it's a very unique, interesting take on cyberpunk, because usually cyberpunk is, like I said earlier, it's like it's very dark and a lot of like serious themes, and it takes that sort of it's almost like a cartoon, almost like an anime in parts, because it's so like lighthearted and funny, and just like by the end of it you feel like you've been on like a long journey with these characters, and like you really bonded with these people, and this is overall like a great movie, like, and it's a hell of a movie to watch on Blu-ray as well. Like if you have a good TV set, man, like it's almost like a demo disc sort of material. That scene when they're at the opera on Blu-ray is like one of the best scenes I've ever seen, like in HD. It's crazy.
And it still holds up. Like you would imagine, like it would be outdated or it would look fake, or I guess because it's practical effects, it still holds, even though the designs are outlandish, right? And the creatures are outlandish, and everything, you could say looks ridiculous, but within that world, it's not ridiculous, right? Like within that world, you can believe it, because it creates this whole narrative and this whole world building where you're like, yeah, how it would look. Like, it's very abstract and original, but it's also very specific in its design.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of it, man. It's if you're gonna do something on the level of this, you really gotta be consistent, and you really gotta have a really good vision of what you're doing, because I think that's the problem that like Cowboy Bebop had, because like these guys adapted something and they didn't have a clear vision of what they were trying to do. So I think that's part of the problem. But I mean, I would love to like go more in depth on like these type of movies and have like particular like videos on them, but I think we're going almost at 2 hours, so I think we're gonna kind of wrap it up. But yeah, I think do you have any final thoughts on Blade Runner or sci-fi films as a whole as we close out here?
I think you can, with some of the bigger science fiction films, I think you could see a progression from 2001: A Space Odyssey to Alien to Aliens, Terminator, T2, Matrix, Blade Runner and Fifth Element, Dark City, and then obviously Star Wars and other things. But I think all of the classic ones were a combination of practical and special effects. I think we started to see the peak of practical effects and the peak of special effects with the first Matrix, and I think that was like the pinnacle of it all. And I think that balance started to lean the other way with the second Matrix film, Matrix Reloaded. You still had a little bit of it. You had the Chateau scene where it was a combination of CGI and a combination of practical effects and martial arts. But then you had the things with the multiple Agent Smiths and everything like that was much more CGI heavy. And then of course Matrix 3 and everything after that has been completely CGI. The Marvel films, to Disney films, to Sony superhero films, and if you had to ask me, like, out of all the superhero films, is there a superhero film that's a combination of practical effects and CGI like any of these old action adventure science fiction films are? I can't really think of any. I know my favorite modern, like, CGI heavy anime science fiction type of film was Alita Battle Angel, and I think that's because the CGI doesn't completely overshadow everything in terms of, like, the world building and the archetypes of the characters and the anime and the tropes. I think that's still kind of there, but that's always, James Cameron can go 100% CGI with things like Avatar and things that he does, but he still manages to keep a little bit of the sense of that old school style, because he used to be a set guy. He would design sets and things like that before he became a director. So he's got that practical interest in the technology, even though he's heading 100% CGI. But I think a lot of that blame is with the Wachowskis. I think they blended it perfectly together with the Matrix, and I think things should have stayed blended together, so we don't lose character design and set design and all that practical elements that make a film feel more like an art piece and like a world building thing versus like something created in a computer, which is no different than a cutscene in a video game that's also created in a computer. So yeah, I think there's a trajectory between all of those, and I think when you watch a lot of those older films in the first half of that trajectory, they're still memorable, they're still good, they're still well balanced as a whole. Whereas, when you look at the newer stuff, it's just not as well balanced. And I think the guy, if I had to pick one guy that did do some blending of practical effects with special effects recently, it would be Villeneuve with Blade Runner 2049, and specifically with Dune, because I know with Dune he did practical effects with CGI, but that's like one in a blue moon in the last 20-30 years. So
yeah, I need to do a talk on Dune, like a full-on review, but I haven't really had the time yet. But I mean, we sort of did a talk back one as a group, but I wasn't really there for very long, and I just felt like a lot of the points that were brought up were kind of like initial reaction. But now that I've had time to think about it, I really feel like, regardless of how you feel about Dune, I think it is an accomplishment, man, because like to come out with a movie like that in 2021, man, it's like, that's not easy to do. And I just feel like with sci-fi, it's such an easy genre to sort of get temptation and make everything CGI, and like it's not easy to bring sort of that kind of a old school feeling that, 'cause I got a lot of old school vibes watching Dune that I don't really get anymore from like sci-fi movies that come out recently. And I think a lot of that has to do with psychology of where people are now in the world, and how everything is sort of like, let's just take the easy route. And I think you don't really get movies like Blade Runner from taking the easy route, and it has a lot of heart in the movie in terms of just the characteristics that come about from the difficulties, because the documentary of how Blade Runner was made was just like, man, these guys went through hell on set, man, and it really shows at the end, because they created a masterpiece with that film, and to me it's an all-time classic. So I mean, closing thoughts, man, I really do feel like if you haven't seen Blade Runner, I suggest watching it, because it is a definitive sci-fi film that I think everyone should watch. It's not for everyone, and I know a lot of people out there have opinions about how it's kind of boring, which I don't disagree with. I think people that say the Blade Runner is kind of boring, it's not an invalid statement, but what it is, it's a movie that sucks you in, and it really gives you the feeling of being in a different place, and every time it always sort of calls me back every time I want to rewatch it. So yeah, I mean, just want to thank Bad Val for coming on, and this has been a good talk, man. And that's gonna be it, man, for this classics episode of Blade Runner. I want to do more of these because I think the Merc had a really good idea with doing these classics episodes.
There's a lot of films. There's a lot of films.
There's a lot, and there's some big ones. Like, I was debating on doing Blade Runner today, or Predator, or RoboCop, and I think
Ooh, RoboCop.
it's yes. RoboCop is one of those movies that I'm like, you know what? I gotta see if we can get a couple of guys in here for that, because
RoboCop really stands alone too, because if you think about like the cloth that it's cut from, like, yeah, you know, it's partly a product of, you know, Blade Runner and that type of thing. It's also like, when you think of Terminator 2, it stands alone, but Terminator 2 is very much like a progression of Terminator 1. But then when you look at RoboCop, it's the same cloth, but it's pushed to like the darkest, most cynical aspect of that version of that film that exists. Like if T2 is like the mainstream blockbuster balanced version of it, then RoboCop is like the darker shade of that, right? Like it's just a little bit more cynical and a little bit more sarcastic and a little bit more deep in its like capitalism and the, you know, the themes of it and the darkness of it. I haven't seen the sequels to RoboCop. I've only seen the first one, so I don't know if the second one's any good. Or
I'll say this on.
Horrible one.
I'll say this on record. I mean, look, RoboCop 2 is nowhere near the film RoboCop 1 is. But goddamn, Frank Miller's involvement in that film. He put some.
Oh wow, I didn't know. So Frank Miller was involved in RoboCop 2.
Listen, RoboCop 2 is trash, but god damn do I love that movie. God damn do I love that movie. There's some stuff in that, like that final fight between him and the other RoboCop is like one of the... Okay, we'll go into it, so stay tuned for that, because that's... I gotta talk about that. You should definitely watch it. I suggest watch it.
I gotta check it out. I know I loved RoboCop, the first one, so... You know, sometimes it's like what you say, like you'll see a second film. Maybe it's not as good as the first one, but there's elements that you like more, you know? Sometimes.
It's basically imagine if they made a crazy comic book sequel to RoboCop 1, but they didn't hold back. They put all kinds of crazy stuff, the stuff that you would not even listen, man. They put a psychotic killer's brain into a cyborg. That's all I gotta say about that. Anyway, yeah, man. Again, I appreciate you coming on. I want to make this more regular, and thanks for everyone that was that tuned in. And we're gonna go ahead and get out of here. So if you enjoyed it, remember to like the video and subscribe, because you know, I want to sort of make this a regular thing, and hopefully we can build up our own channels, and eventually Talkback can return. But until then, I'm gonna go ahead and get out of here. Yeah, thanks guys.